What I'm going to do is to present a summary of the paper that you have received. And as the Deputy Prime Minister said, Ukraine indeed did very well from 2000 to September 2008. It's not only that the GDP was growing at the rate of about 7.5% per year, but very important, the country was able to implement very prudent fiscal policies. The average fiscal deficit between 2000 and 2007 was less than 1%, a fiscal deficit of less than 1% per year. Many countries in the world would be envious of basically having such a good fiscal policies. If the crisis was caused by anything, it was not caused because the government was irresponsibly spending much more than what it could do. Of course, even in 2008, the fiscal balance was only 1.5% of GDP, a deficit of 1.5% of GDP. Now this year, of course, is likely to be about 6%, but next year the commitment with the IMF is that the fiscal deficit would be limited to 4% of GDP. Inflation was increasing, but it was brought to a declining trend from the beginning of 2008, and this year is probably going to be in the order of 15%. The exchange rate was indeed pretty stable at around 5.2. The current account during 2000 to 2005 was in a big surplus. In 2006, 2007, some deficits took place, but these deficits in 2006 and 2007 were fully covered by foreign direct investments. However, in 2008, the deficit in the current account of the balance of payments was indeed very, 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 very high. Gross international reserve, because of the amount of foreign capital that the country was receiving, gross international reserve indeed were increasing to 32 billion by the end of 2007, 31 by basically, or 30 by, this time. And government debt, although it was declining, it has increased recently, principally because of lending by the IMF. Now, however, it is very clear that Ukraine is a country that suffered a lot from the crisis, as the Deputy Prime Minister was saying. The stock index collapsed by 74% during 2008, just in a few months. This is one of the largest declines in the world. I think that only Iceland had a drop in the stock index more than Ukraine. The exchange rate depreciated by 58%, again, one of the highest in the world. The drop in GDP during the first half of 2009 was 19%. Exports collapsed by 49%. Industrial production by 30%. Unemployment increased from about 66% to 9%. And real household income declined by minus 10% in the first half of 2009. If we compare what happened in Ukraine with other countries, we can see, and the data that we have for the first quarter of 2009, we can see that Ukraine indeed had one of the deepest drops in GDP, 20% in the first quarter, greater than almost every country compared with Romania, 6, Hungary, 6, Mexico, 8, Latvia, 18, and so on. And the depreciation of 58% in the last quarter of last year was also one of the steepest compared with almost every country. So clearly, Ukraine basically was affected by the crisis as many other countries, but it was affected more than almost any other countries. And the question is, why Ukraine suffered more than almost any other emerging economy? What was there that made Ukraine more vulnerable to this crisis than almost any other country in the world? Now, I think that if we look at the performance of the real sector, we start to look at the situation. In the chart on the left, we can see that in 2003 and 2004, exports was really the main source of growth in the economy. But in 2005, 2006, and 2007, really the main driving force was domestic demand, consumption and investments. And this domestic demand was stimulated by increases in pension payments, by increasing minimum wages, and also by a huge amount of foreign credits that were granted to the Ukrainian economy. So the growth was really driven by exports initially and later on by domestic demand. But we can see that in the last quarter of 2008 and in 2009, both exports and domestic demands collapsed. We can see that major declines took place in export-oriented industries and also those sectors that were very dependent on credit, like construction, machine building. You can see the very major decline that took place in construction activities, in industry, in even retail trade. Ukraine is quite open, but also very undiversified. It's open because the share of exports in GDP is 50%. It's a very large share. In the US, it's what, around 10, 15%? In most European countries, it's less than 20%. In Ukraine, exports as a percentage of GDP is 50%. But the unfortunate thing is that almost 60% of exports are concentrated just in a handful of products. Metals, minerals, and chemicals account for 60% of total exports. But not only that, not only exports are very concentrated on a handful of products, but also they are not geographically diversified. You can see here that Russia, for example, is the largest buyer of Ukrainian products. On metallurgical and minerals, it accounts for 30%. On machinery and equipment, 17%. In agricultural products, 6%. On chemicals, 20%. Ukraine is very dependent on what happened in just a few countries. What happened in Russia, what happened in Turkey, what happened in Kazakhstan, and very few countries. The United States is almost irrelevant. It's less than 5% of total exports. So clearly this was a major problem as basically metal prices collapsed and exports of the value of metals and mineral products collapsed. Then of course, they had a very negative effect on the economy. Now, the second reason why Ukraine was affected more severely is because over the last 3 years, Ukraine had an excessive reliance on foreign capital. And to me, this was probably the most significant factor, and I'm going to show you why. Basically, to me, if we have to identify one single factor, it's basically the incredible amount of debt that Ukraine contracted over 2 to 3 years. Now, this would have been okay if it had not been because there was a combination of several vulnerabilities that affected Ukraine more than any other country. And that is why Ukraine suffered most, that even countries that had a very similar pattern in terms of international trade. The first vulnerability was the fact that in 2008, Ukraine was developing a very significant current account deficit. Exports were growing, but imports were growing at a much faster pace. Exports were growing by about 25%, but imports were growing by 30%. The current account deficit emerged in 2006, but by 2008, the current account deficit was already 7% of GDP. Now, most analysts who were making forecasting in 2008 about the likely current account deficit in 2009, and I'm talking about international financial institutions, but I'm also talking about some of the large international commercial banks, they were really forecasting that the current account deficit in 2009 could be about $24 billion or 30% of GDP. And at that time, it was very clear in 2008 that there was not going to be sufficient foreign financing to cover this current account deficit. And this started to put pressures in the hryvnias. When analysts, when traders started to realize that ceteris paribus, Ukraine was going to have an enormous $24 billion current account deficit. Now, the second vulnerability was the very large external debt that Ukraine had incurred. To me, this is a very interesting chart because it shows that the public sector was not borrowing heavily from abroad.